Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Dash Core Group presentation on Dash Economics. Apologies on the link confusion. A friendly reminder that if you're joining late or need to step away, you can always come back and watch it at faster speed or whatever you need to do. It can be reviewed as many times as you need to. Questions will be answered at the end. We'll have a full Q&A section. Please submit your questions via the chat, and Fernando or myself, Michael, will collect them and get them to Ryan or Glenn so that they can answer. And with that, I will hand it over to Ryan.
All right, thank you, Michael. Apologize to everyone for the delay and the link confusion. There was an error with the previous link, and the only way to correct it was to create a new one. And so here we are, getting a late start, but we should be able to run through the information, get to the Q&A as quickly as we can, and give everybody the opportunity to ask as many questions as they have. Before we get started here, just a little bit of background. If you're watching this or reviewing the material on the recording, this is a follow-up presentation to a presentation that I gave at the Dash Core Group Open House back in December. We'll include a link to that original presentation. I won't be going through all of the material that we went through back in December, simply because of the depth of the information. So if you're interested in more background on this, I'd recommend going back to that presentation from December to get a better understanding of the genesis for this conversation. In this presentation, what we're aiming to do is share some of the findings that we've had since December, some of the research and modeling that we've done on Dash's economics, and we're putting forward a proposal that gets specific on changes that we could make to the network in order to improve Dash's store of value properties. And so with that background, we can jump right into it. If we start with the summary slide on the next page. What we shared back in December is that Dash's unique system that involves masternodes, including masternode collateral, masternode incentives, significantly affect the currency's price over long periods of time. We've gone through a couple marked time periods of dramatic change in the price, and we hypothesized that it could be due to some of those economic incentives associated with the masternodes in part, and a declining market rank of Dash, we believe, impedes Dash's adoption. Obviously, on a relative basis, given a choice between two assets, and one seems to be falling within the market cap rankings, it does affect the uptake of the currency and usage of it. We've gone through some analyses in order to show that masternode ROI does lead to predictable behavior that changes circulating supply and relates to our price. We'll share some of that material here. We believe that without any intervention, Dash will likely continue to face price headwinds over the next several years due to high growth of circulating supply. This issue would not last forever, but certainly for the next few years, we'll share some of our findings on how this is likely to play out. And then what we've done here is we've proposed a modest reallocation of block rewards from miners to masternodes to moderate this effect. We looked at a lot of different options coming out of our December presentation, including the possibility to change from proof of work to proof of stake. Ultimately, the analysis and the data led us to conclude that dramatic changes are not needed in order to accomplish the goals. And we really want to minimize the level of change given the sensitivity of changes and the possibility of unforeseen consequences of changes. And so you'll see kind of some of the rationale that led to that decision of what we plan to propose to the network. And then we also seek to address some related shortcomings in our proposal system and transaction fees. We talked about those things as well during the December presentation. Those are further optimizations to the network economics. Each of these can be pursued independently of one another. And so we'll talk about how we will, as a network, make decisions around them and how we move forward from here. So that's kind of the high level overview of what we'll go over today. For those of you who may be watching this just for an interest in token economics or an example of one of the ways that a network is dealing with this, you may not be familiar with Dash. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this slide, but Dash is a payments-focused digital currency. We focus on speed, ease of use, low costs, and high scalability in order to achieve that. And we do have different constituencies within our network. That includes the network operators themselves. In our network, they're called masternode operators, and they have a unique set of needs along with our users, merchants, and developers that can develop applications on our forthcoming platform. When we think about the product, what it is that we produce, yes, we produce a payment network that does all of these things. It is easy to use, it is instant, it is inexpensive, it is secure, etc. Residing on that network is Dash the currency, and it is its own product in a sense. And so what we're talking about today is really aimed at the currency portion of our offering and focuses on how to make the currency better for the users. And so, just as background, that's how we're thinking about this. And we do think of the currency as a portion of a broader solution. Next slide. Now, we have focused a lot of attention on markets in which cryptocurrency is well positioned to address, or Dash in particular is well positioned to address because transactions are instant. It makes Dash more feasible at the point of sale than other cryptocurrencies. It opens up use cases that other cryptocurrencies can't address. And so we focused our growth on 3 areas. One is within Venezuela. The strategy there is focused on the hyperinflation that the country is going through. And so cryptocurrency can bring stability. And in Venezuela, most of the transactions still take place in the real world as opposed to online. And therefore, they need to be instant. They also need to be low cost. And we've got the ability as a network to fund local teams on the ground through our proposal system that can help it adopt and grow within that region. We've also focused on the remittance market. We've spun up several different services within the Latin America corridor in order to facilitate the transfer of value between countries. And lastly, we focus on the cryptocurrency trading markets. Dash has tremendous value there because of the instant transfers between exchanges. Many exchanges now support instant send locks and chain locks. Both are technologies that accelerate the deposit process. And that allows Dash to be a useful means of transferring value between exchanges for the purposes of rebalancing of assets for market makers, in terms of arbitrage opportunities that might otherwise go to waste. And so the result of this is we've seen tremendous growth in activity on the network. This is the last 2 years of growth. The Q2 estimate is through early this week. We're averaging a typical day nearly 20,000 economic transactions per day. And so we've seen this, tremendously consistent growth curve as we've penetrated each of these markets and some others that we've been focused on as well. And so we've been really successful on the technology end of things and gaining adoption and getting Dash used in the market. And that hasn't necessarily translated into equal success on price. And it does kind of beg the question, why? If we go back to the presentation in December and kind of circle back on some of the hypotheses that we were presenting to the community, we'll walk through that briefly and then what some of the findings have been here. So when we talk about Dash's long-term price volatility, what is it that we're talking about? If you flip to the next slide. On a day-to-day basis, prices obviously fluctuate. Across the cryptocurrency markets, there's a high correlation between asset prices. Kind of almost as Bitcoin goes, the rest of the market tends to go on a day-to-day basis. And when we look at Dash's volatility on a day-to-day basis, what we find is that Dash is no more volatile than any similar cryptocurrency. We've plotted the recent volatility on a daily measure here of Dash and other assets. Dash is in the light blue. And what we find is that Dash isn't any more volatile. And so when we're talking about volatility and store of value improvements, I just want to clarify what type of volatility we're talking about. And this is the long-term systemic changes in Dash's price relative to the rest of the market. We did talk about this back in December. On the next slide, I'll share some data with you. If you can flip to the next slide, there we go. On Dash's long-term price underperformance. Now, prior to mid-2017, Dash's performance was phenomenal. We were rising up market cap rankings. We had a significant momentum behind the project in terms of price and market cap ranking. And starting in about mid-2017, Dash began to fall down the market cap rankings. And if we plot that period and look at that on a quarterly basis, here's what we find. On the left-hand side, I've plotted the percentage price change of Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, and Dash, each of the last 10 quarters. What we find is that Dash has been in the upper half of that performance on only 3 occasions. And so 70% of the time we have been underperforming the market. And it tends to be that, on days when the market was up, Dash would be up a bit less. When the markets were down, Dash might be down a fraction more on average. And these accumulate over time. And so when we index the price of Dash against these other assets at the end of Q3 2017, why Q3 2017? Well, Bitcoin Cash spun up during Q3, and so it's really the first chance that I have to plot us against all four. But this really is around the same time frame when Dash began to underperform the rest of the market. And what we find is that these accumulate over long periods of time into relative market performance shortfall. And so that's what you see here on the right. I indexed all of these back to their prices on September 30th, 2017 to an index price of 100, and then plotted that going forward. And so this is the type of volatility that we're talking about. Dramatic outperformance in 2016, 2017, dramatic underperformance starting mid-2017. And that isn't always the case. Q1 of 2020 was a great quarter for us, just as an example. And so, this is just something that is accumulated over long periods of time. So next slide. The hypothesis that we presented back in December is that a lot of the price changes that have occurred in the past were due to changes in our circulating supply and changes in masternode collateral. In order to upgrade your node on the network to a full masternode, you need to collateralize 1,000 Dash. That means you need to accumulate 1,000 Dash, and you need to sign a message to the network proving ownership over that 1,000 Dash. And if you move it from that address at any point, your masternode is downgraded, and you cease to earn rewards and perform services for the network. And so we presented a slide similar to this one back in December, and we showed that as the masternode reward began to increase back in 2014 and throughout 2015, naturally the number of masternodes operating on the network began to increase as well. And we really saw that continuing even after the masternode allocation stopped changing. It took a little bit of time for the markets to fully react to that. And when those masternodes were being formed, they were being formed by purchasing circulating supply. And as you can see in this graph, that really tamped down the circulating supply at any point in time for Dash. And that continued throughout the first half of 2017. Since that point in time, the circulating supply has begun to grow. Back in December, I had this chart through Q3 of 2019. And I predicted at that point in time that we were likely to see a decline in the number of masternodes operating on the network over the next couple of quarters. And that's exactly what has happened. And what that does is it increases our circulating supply at a pretty high annualized rate. And we'll kind of convert this chart into some of those numbers in a moment. Now, one of the objections that I heard from the community, from members of the Dash core group team, is that this concept of circulating supply is false, because masternode collateral can be cashed out at any point in time. And that is absolutely true. Masternode collateral, in that sense, is circulating. It can be moved to an exchange and sold on the open market at any point in time, and remains completely liquid. And so I want to draw a distinction here. I use the term circulating supply to describe these coins that are not being collateralized in a masternode and effectively removed from the market. That term may not sit well with you. You may object to the term. If you prefer a different term, feel free to use it. If you prefer the term non-masternode collateral coins, or you prefer to call them widget coins, the label is less important than the concept. What I'm talking about here, and when I refer to circulating supply, I'm referring to circulating supply that is not collateralizing a masternode. So when I talk about this throughout the presentation, that's the definition. So if the term is a barrier for you, feel free to use a different term or different terminology that will sit well with you. But the concept is what's important. If we're aligned on the concept of what circulating supply is, that's what's important for the purposes of the presentation. So when we look at the annualized circulating supply growth rates that result from the numbers on the previous slide, what you'll find is that prior to mid-2016, circulating supply was, if you could flip back, here we go. Circulating supply was actually very low or contracting in many quarters prior to mid-2017. And we talked about how in Q1 of 2017 in particular, this shows a circulating supply annualized growth rate of about 30%. That's only partially true, and part of the reason for it is this was the quarter that Evan Duffield, the founder of Dash, ceased operating his masternodes. He'd been receiving a lot of criticism from the community of operating masternodes and voting on proposals that affected the Dash core group, and so he made the decision to cease operating those in January-February timeframe. And when he did that, he may have turned off his masternodes, but the coins didn't necessarily flow through to the market and enter circulating supply in the sense that we're talking about. And so, taking that into account, what we really saw prior to mid-2017 is a tremendous contraction in the coins that were available on the market. And that during that time frame, Dash's price was outperforming the rest of the market. And it makes sense. If there's demand for the coin and it is becoming scarcer on the market, it makes sense that the price would appreciate. Now, after mid-2017, if we plot this going forward, this is when the circulating supply really started to grow at a pretty rapid rate. In fact, if you average this over this time period, it's been averaging about 22% annualized growth rate. And so our coin supply began to grow very quickly during this time frame. And it's continued to be high here in 2020. And we'll talk more about that and some of the projections that we now have. But during this time frame, although the markets were going up throughout the second half of 2017, Dash was underperforming the rest of the market. And throughout 2018 and 2019, we saw the same thing. And the hypothesis, therefore, of all this data coming out of the December presentation was that it seemed likely that these were correlated events and could explain some of our relative market performance. On the next slide, what I've done is this is another slide that I shared in December, but I've updated it for the current numbers. These are circulating supply inflation rates as of this month. Right now, Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash have a supply growth rate of about 1.8% on an annualized basis. Litecoin is currently about 4%. And shockingly, the US dollar M2 money supply over the last most recent 13-week period is growing at about a 36% annualized rate. That is just a shockingly high number and might be the highest number of my entire lifetime. And typically M2 money supply grows between 6 and 7%. That's kind of the long-term average. Of course, this is spurred on by the coronavirus and related financial crash that occurred back in March. Dash's current growth rate in total supply is around 7.7%. Now, this can fluctuate a little bit based on how much of the budget proposals are approved. That's why I have to take a backward-looking number for Dash. And so this was the number that occurred in Q1. Also, Dash's circulating supply in Q1, this grew at 23%. And so why is there a distinction between the two numbers? Well, Dash's total supply is increasing at that 7.7%. In addition, masternode liquidations do add to the circulating supply over time. And so the last couple of quarters, we've seen the number of masternodes operating on the network decline, and those enter circulating supply and cause that to grow at a much higher rate. And so when you compare Dash to some of these other assets, it's really hard for Dash to maintain price parity against assets like Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash if the circulating supply is growing as fast as it is. Now, Dash has a lot of advantages over these other coins. We have our proposal system. We have the ability to actually proactively build our network. We've got more development efforts taking place than many of these coins, or certainly not Bitcoin, just because of the size of the ecosystem. But we've been able to introduce chain locks and instant send by default at this point, made that much more scalable. We're very close on platform at this point, and so we continue to innovate. We continue to have adoption take place in various markets around the world. And those things all have their advantages. We don't have to be better than other coins on all dimensions in order to be competitive. But I would argue that a 23% growth rate in circulating supply is something that's really tough to overcome with growth. And so I think that it behooves the network to take a close look at this and to see if we can get closer to parity with some of these other coins, and allow our advantages to then accrue to the network. So what did we go test after December? Well, one, we wanted to test the hypothesis that changes in circulating supply do in fact cause Dash's relative market performance to be affected. We also wanted to determine whether the nominal masternode return on investment leads to masternode collateral demand. This is the number most people are familiar with when they ask what is the return of operating a masternode. Well, a masternode pays 60 Dash a year. It costs 1,000 Dash to start one. The masternode ROI is 6%. That's typically the number that people focus on when communicating the value of operating a masternode. We also had the hypothesis that masternodes are likely not taking inflation into account. In other words, a 20% return might be great, but if the coin is doubling in its supply every year, that might not be such a great real return. And we'll talk more about the difference between real ROI and nominal ROI in a moment, and what our findings were there. And lastly, we want to test that masternode nominal ROI demanded by the market may cause further liquidation of masternodes. That certainly has played out over the last couple of quarters, but we wanted to see if we could predict how that might play out more accurately. The ultimate aim of all of this analysis is to develop a solution that will stabilize Dash's store of value over long periods of time while minimizing the amount of change that we're proposing to the network. Well, why do we want to minimize the amount of change? And the answer is because changes involve risk. If we make significant changes to the network, there may be unforeseen consequences. And so if there is a solution that allows us to address the issue that we see without major disruption to the way that the network works, that's going to be a solution that we're going to be most comfortable implementing. So here's some of the analysis that we did. In order to test the hypothesis of whether circulating supply growth impacts price, we've plotted the last 30 or so quarters. And basically what we find is that on the x-axis here's what you see is our change in circulating supply within each quarter. And on the y-axis is Dash's performance relative to the rest of the market. Why are we choosing to plot this against the rest of the market? Well, the answer is the market itself moves up and down, driven largely by Bitcoin, and remains highly correlated. And so, like it or not, Bitcoin's performance really does affect all of the coins to a large degree. It's one of the primary causes of price increases and declines. And so we want to filter that out as much as we can. And as a result, we simply plotted Dash's performance relative to the rest of the market in order to better isolate the changes that are happening in our network versus the market as a whole. And when we did this, what we find is when circulating supply is expanding, that's the right-hand side of this graph, Dash's relative performance to the rest of the market is relatively subdued. We don't have dramatic outperformance typically in quarters like that. And if we look at the quarters, and they're rare, but they do exist, where circulating supply is actually contracting, what we find is that Dash's performance relative to the market tends to be quite good. And when you plot this and find the best fit line, you find an R-squared value of about 0.22. Now, 0.22 is a moderate correlation. And it's a number that I would expect to see if there is a correlation here. Why? Well, because there's lots of things that affect performance, Dash's performance on the market. Adoption matters. Technology introduction matters. Regulatory changes matter. The addition of major exchanges or Dash's features on those exchanges matter for adoption and price and usage and so on. And so I wouldn't expect an R-squared value that's very high or close to 1, because there are so many different things that affect price. And so seeing a R-squared value of 0.22, that is an encouraging number to see. It implies that there is a correlation here between these two metrics. Now, of course, correlation is not causation. Just because there's a correlation here doesn't mean that one is causing the other. So we need to do additional analysis in order to suss that out. Just as an example, delivery of a major release could cause confidence in the project to increase, and that could cause a simultaneous increase in the price, along with a simultaneous increase in the number of master nodes, and therefore a contraction in the circulating supply. And so basically, there could be a common cause that causes both of these things to be correlated without one of these things causing the other. And so we need to test that. We need to determine whether or not that's true. And so if you go to the next slide, we wanted to analyze whether or not the masternode ROI actually is what's driving that masternode collateral demand that leads to a change in the circulating supply. And so what you see on this plot is you see the nominal ROI at the beginning of the quarter. This is the headline ROI we're used to seeing. And then on the y-axis is what was the growth in masternode count during the quarter. And what we find is that there is a very strong correlation here. And so if we're able to measure what the ROI is at the beginning of a quarter, we can predict what might happen in terms of masternode count changes during that following quarter with a fair amount of certainty. And so it does seem that the masternode ROI affects the creation of masternodes, and that makes sense. If you have a higher ROI, it incentivizes more of that activity. And if you reward something less, it seems logical that the market would produce less of it. It also makes sense on an individual decision-making level. If I see a high ROI, I'm more likely to act. I'm more likely to create a masternode in order to benefit from that ROI. And so we've established a couple things with these analyses. One is that masternode ROI results in a behavior. That behavior is to buy masternodes or to begin operating them. And there is a high correlation between that activity and price. As potential masternode operators see the opportunity, purchase masternodes to begin participating, that has a positive impact on the price. That purchasing behavior has a positive impact on price. And so all of the pieces seem to come together and are supported by analyses that show that these things are very correlated and causal. And so one of the areas that I was wrong if we go to the next slide, is I had postulated that masternodes were primarily looking at that nominal ROI when evaluating, whether or not to operate a masternode, and that as the ROI of operating masternodes kind of would stagnate here around 6-7%, and therefore the number of masternodes would begin to decline. And although that has played out over the short term, I'll share some analysis with you on why I don't think that that is the case. I think it's far more nuanced. That published ROI demanded by the market has declined. But if you look at real ROI, that has actually gone up. What do we mean by real ROI? Well, this is probably best shared with an example. Back in Q4 of 2014, operating a masternode was, theoretically quite profitable. The annualized reward was about 22% at that point in time. However, the coin supply itself was growing at about 27%. And by the time, so if you take that into account, the real ROI being generated by masternodes was negative. It was negative 5%. And so what we find when we plot this over time, the nominal ROI and real ROI, is that it appears like the real ROI is actually a lot more stable than the nominal ROI. It's more consistent over time. It appears to be more predictable. It's also clear that both are important to investors, both the nominal and the real. And so it does seem like masternodes are far more rational than I'd assumed in their investment decisions. And it appears that actually real ROI might be more important to them. And so we dug into this issue and analyzed it a bit more deeply. Remember back in 2014 and throughout 2015, the masternode rewards were changing. They were shifting from miners to masternodes. It then took a turn the other way briefly towards the end of 2015. And it took a while for the market to fully stabilize after all of those changes took place. And we really didn't see consistent numbers until around the second half of 2016. So if you flip to the next slide, we really looked at that period since mid-2016. And what we did is we tried to weight these two in a way that would generate a best fit line, trend line between these two numbers. And what we found is that the best fit weighting is achieved when you weight about 54% of the weighting towards the real ROI and 46% towards nominal ROI. And the result is incredibly consistent. It's incredibly consistent over time, what the market has demanded in terms of these two metrics and the weighting that it places on the two of them. And it's really only varied between that weighted average has trended between 2 to 2.75%, and really hasn't extended beyond that range in either direction. And so this is really interesting. It's also really good news. Why is it good news? Well, it means I was wrong about a couple of things. One is I was wrong that masternodes would continue to demand 6% or more masternode returns in order to continue operating. And I'm referring to the nominal ROI would need to stay around 6%. That means that nominal ROI is likely to continue dropping in terms of what the masternodes demand. And that significantly affects projections in terms of how many masternodes are likely to continue operating on the network over time. That's the first piece of good news. It means that masternode liquidations are not going to occur at the rate that I had presented to the community back in December. The second piece of good news is that relatively modest changes to the masternode reward can drive a lot more effect than was assumed back in December. It can result in a lot better retention of the number of masternodes operating on the network, or even encourage the adoption of or the creation of net new masternodes on the network. And so this was a great finding. It really affected all of our models in a very positive way, and it greatly lessened the degree of the issue that we were likely to face going forward. And I have strong confidence in what I'm seeing here because it has remained so consistent over time. It is practically a flat line. There are some points in time when the ROI, the weighted ROI demanded by the market was a bit lower or a bit higher, but it's been very, very consistent. And so when we start to build this into some of our models, on the next slide, this is a look forward, assuming that the historical weighted ROI that you saw on that previous slide continues into the future, based on the masternode rewards that we project and based on a modest growth in transaction fees, et cetera. And so we just set a set of assumptions and projected forward what the masternode collateral and circulating supply growth would look like. And this plots it out through the year 2030. So this is about a 10-year period here. And what you'll see is that over that 10-year period, the number of coins a little more than doubles. This is, a significant growth, but given the long period of time, it's not that high of a growth rate over the entire period. The growth rate is weighted more heavily in the beginning, and the growth rate tapers off over time. And so this is a model under a set of assumptions that assumes that weighted ROI continues that we saw here at the end of Q1 2020. So if we flip to the next slide, when we take that same set of projections as well as our historical data prior to 2020 and plot that out over time, what we find is that the annual circulating supply growth actually was contracting back in 2015, stayed very tight in 2016, and the first half of 2017. Starting in mid-2017, that's when we saw the high, greater than 20% growth rate in our circulating supply. That actually expanded a bit in 2018, and 2019 seemed to be the peak year in which our circulating supply was expanding the fastest. We are partway through 2020, so we've already gotten a preview into how this is likely to play out. And if we assume that the weighted ROI demanded by the masternode market continues, we'd see probably around a 14% growth rate here in 2020. There's good news and bad news on this plot. The good news is it appears like the worst of it is already behind us. It kind of was behind us at the end of 2019. And that's the really good news. The bad news is that it's projected to remain pretty elevated compared to our competitors for quite a while into the future. for the next 5 years or so, this could be a significant headwind for us. Not like it has been, but certainly will continue. And so when we assess all of this, we determine, A, this isn't as bad as it, or isn't as challenging, I should say, as it could have been, or we thought it could be back in December. But we should still take action against this because these growth rates are high for the market that we're in. Next slide. So as we assess this, again, I want to remind everybody that what we're aiming to do is try to minimize the disruption to the network, but address this headwind so that the network can focus on what we do best, which is continuing to grow our user base, continuing to grow our merchant base, and continue to innovate. And we feel like this is, a significant barrier for that adoption to occur. If you flip to the next slide, I'll summarize briefly what the solution that we're proposing looks like. This is a modest reallocation of about 9% of the block rewards from miners to masternodes. The allocation will be front loaded, meaning a lot of the reallocation will happen over the near term in order to offset what is the highest projected inflation period as best we can. This is also a very gradual process. It takes place over 5.5 years. We're not talking about shocking changes on an individual quarter basis. This is very subtle and very methodical and slow to occur. In the end state, the allocation after this 9% reallocation would be approximately 36% to the miners, 54% to the masternodes, and the remaining 10% towards the proposal system. It would alter the peak circulating supply growth rate from around 12.5% to 7.5%. This is a significant reduction in the gap between, Litecoin, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin, and others in the space. I don't feel that we need to fully close the gap. That's challenging without changing our coin supply. I want to emphasize none of these changes change the overall number of Dash that's created. They simply manage the rate at which they circulate into the market. You will notice a discrepancy between the 12.5% and the 14% that I referenced earlier for all of 2020. The reason for that discrepancy is because the first half of 2020 saw a higher rate than we project for the second half of 2020. And so on a go-forward basis, we're projecting a peak annualized growth rate of about 12.5%. This is a net benefit to all the participants in our network. And that may seem counterintuitive, so let me explain a little bit about that. Because a shift from miners to masternodes would have a relative effect on price of supporting the price by creating demand for masternode collateral. Users would benefit in a couple of different ways. One is the lower inflation that would result and the relative price support. I say relative price support because there are lots of things that affect price. This doesn't mean price will definitely go up because other factors could cause it to go down. And so we're talking about the relative effect. On a relative basis, demand for masternode supports price. The second is masternodes. This might be the most obvious beneficiary, and some might say, "Hey, wouldn't this be masternodes voting in benefits for themselves. Well, it's a bit more complex than that. This is not a static environment. If you raise masternode rewards, it encourages the creation of new masternodes. What that means is, for an individual masternode owner, the benefit isn't the higher rewards. The reason is because if more masternodes are created as a result of higher portion of our rewards going towards masternodes, it means they get paid less often. So although they may be getting paid a larger amount than they otherwise would be paid with each payment, they'll also be being paid less frequently. What that means is that the primary benefit to masternode owners would be the same as it is for our users, and that is the coins that they hold would, on a relative basis, have a portion of price support. And so masternode owners would likely benefit in proportion to the number of coins that they hold, very similar to users. Miners counterintuitively may actually benefit from this as well. Why is that? If their rewards are dropping in terms of Dash denominated rewards, how could this possibly be beneficial? Well, one, because of the relative price support, on a relative basis, they may be getting less Dash denominated rewards, but the value of those should be higher. And when you take that into account, it's effectively neutral. It's impossible to project exactly how much of an effect this would have on price, but if you assume that the market cap of the circulating supply remains roughly unchanged by this whole change, it should be enough of a small price appreciation to overcome some of the short-term losses in masternode rewards in Dash denominated terms. We'll get more into that in a minute. I've got a chart on that. In the long run, certainly we will be spending less with masternodes, and the value of that will decline. But the real declines don't happen for a year and a half, 2 years, or even longer. And the result of that is that anyone who's invested in mining equipment already would be able to fully monetize that, and any future decisions, they'd be able to take the changes into account. Lastly, our proposal owners. If there is relative price support from this, and logically there should be, it means a larger proposal system in terms of what that 10% that we have allocated towards the proposal system would fund. And so when you look at each of these constituencies individually, it makes sense for virtually all of them to support a change like this. The next point is that Dash's X11 dominance is maintained. We'll talk more about security and the dominance of the X11 algorithm in a moment, but that's certainly a concern for people. And then the last thing here is this implementation is simple. This wouldn't take quarters of development away from the development team to go execute. We've actually had scheduled masternode reward changes in the code back in 2014 and 2015 that ratcheted up the rewards automatically. And so the code has already been developed and implemented and used on our network. We would simply need to include this in an upcoming release. And so the implementation itself would be something that we would have a high degree of confidence of being able to deliver quickly. Next slide. We'll get into the details here of how this reallocation would actually take place. This is a complex chart, And so let me explain what's going on here. Across the x-axis, you see the quarters going forward through the year 2026. As I mentioned, this is a 5.5-year process. The blue bars are associated with the left-hand axis, and that is the reallocation that would occur in each quarter. And then on the right-hand side, you see the cumulative masternode allocation between miners and masternodes. I want to point out that the allocation percentages presented are associated with the non-proposal funding portion of the block reward. Right now, we have a 10% proposal allocation. And so when we say in the end state that 60% will be masternodes and 40% going to miners, it's 60% of the non-proposal 90%. And so I'm drawing that distinction because in parallel, we are proposing a change to the proposal allocation model and how that occurs. And so I'm trying to just extract that portion of the decision away. So this would apply to transaction fees, and it would apply to the non-proposal block reward allocation. So what is this proposing? Well, in the beginning, starting late this year, we would do 0.6% reallocation per quarter from miners to masternodes. Another 5 quarters going forward from that at 0.5%, then 0.4, 0.3, 0.2, and then a couple quarters at 0.1%. And the result is kind of this smooth curve of the masternode rewards being reallocated over a 5.5-year period, roughly 10% of the non-proposal funding. So I have this in a chart in the appendix. We'll release the slides after the presentation, and you can see quarter by quarter exactly what these numbers are. If you're interested, you can see each quarter's reallocation, the cumulative reallocation, and what that means for masternodes and miners in that quarter. So what would happen to our projections if we revise this masternode allocation? Well, the obvious result is that it would result in more masternodes than would otherwise be the case, and it would therefore result in a lower growth rate in the circulating supply. And so what we've done is we've made all the same assumptions on everything else. We want to isolate just this one metric. And we assumed that the ROI demanded by the market continues into the future, just as the other model did. The only difference here is the masternode reward. And what we find is that it has a modest impact on the number of masternodes being created, as well as a slight reduction in the growth rate of the circulating supply. And so if we flip to the next slide, what kind of an effect does that have on our circulating supply growth rates? If we annualize that growth rate in each of the quarters and project it going forward, what does that actually do? Well, as a reminder, we're already partway through 2020, so we can't fully affect 2020. But on a go-forward basis, it ensures that our circulating supply growth drops below 8%. On an annualized basis. And here you can see why I call this kind of flattening the curve. This is a term we're all familiar with the coronavirus. We're not talking about changing the overall supply. What we are talking about is kind of shifting some of that out into future years when the growth rate begins to decline naturally. And so this really has a great effect over the next 5 years, after which point in time, the issue that we're facing now is greatly diminished in its importance. And so this is truly a one-time event that we would not need to repeat. It would manage the expansion of our circulating supply in a way that's very predictable. If these historical patterns continue, and it means that we reach a point in the future when this is no longer an issue. It bridges the gap. And so this is the strategy that we're putting forward in order to manage our relative market performance and allow us to really focus on growing the ecosystem. It also does away with this barrier to adoption of, Dash's relative market performance over time kind of being a barrier for us. When we drop, down around 20, when people first come to the market and learn about cryptocurrency, they do tend to start at the top. And so the further down the market cap rankings that we have fallen, the more challenging it can be to get that next wave of adoption. We're doing a great job despite that. I don't want to take away from all the efforts of the local teams on the ground, the work of Dash Core Group. We've seen tremendous growth in our adoption. I think that we can accelerate that further if we adopt something like this. Next slide. So if we project forward what Masternode ROI is likely based on these historical trends and the reallocation that we're proposing, this is what it would look like. We are close to a threshold of real ROI beginning to accrue to the masternodes, even after taking inflation into account. That's likely to occur sometime next year. I think that that's an event to celebrate. I think that it is a sign of maturity of our network. And basically, we are kind of entering this phase in which these two numbers are slowly converging on each other. And I think we're converging towards 2-3% in the very long run after the effects of inflation. So, I think that this is kind of what you might expect following the proposal. And I think that this is a healthy convergence to take place. With that, I think that we can shift to kind of talking a little bit about some of the other challenges that we brought up back in December. The next topic that I wanted to cover was the proposal system itself. We had talked about some of the issues there. If you could flip to the next slide. This was a slide that I shared back in December. And I brought up this issue because I've seen firsthand kind of the proposal system go through different types of environments. Back in late 2017, early 2018, during the cryptocurrency bubble, we really saw a couple of behaviors. One is the funding oftentimes went completely unallocated, or I should say partially unallocated. Back towards the end of 2017, there simply weren't enough quality projects to get approved. Dash Core Group actually stopped asking for funding because our balance sheet had grown. We also saw an attitude that, well, it's better if we spend it than to waste it. We saw a lot of dubious or potentially low value proposals hit the network, including like endorsements from celebrities or what have you, that didn't have any lasting effect. And so that certainly isn't the most effective way to use the proposal system. Then in late 2018 through late 2019, when prices at times during that period were quite low, there were at times more genuine network needs than there was funding. We had layoffs within teams, elimination of teams, and a lot of that was simply temporary in nature. The price quickly recovered, but by that point in time, people had moved on. And when the network loses good teams, that certainly is due to this instability. That certainly isn't good for us in the long run. And so the hypothesis here is that perhaps during times like that, the masternodes might be willing to allocate more than 10% of the rewards in order to bridge the gap of what's perceived as a temporary price decline. And so I don't think that 10% works for all situations. We proposed some potential changes back in December, and we've spent a lot of time debating those with the community, and then took a lot of that information internally and debated them internally. And what we think is that we can introduce something that is more flexible, but still put some constraints around the system that cause it to operate in a more logical manner. So if you flip to the next slide, our proposed solution is quite simple. This is one that Eugen had put forward, or a version of it. And what it is we talked about how the funding split, currently 50-50 between masternodes and miners, may shift to 60-40. So for the purposes of illustration here, I've assumed that in the long run we end up at 60-40. But the way that this would work is that by default, all funding would simply be split 60-40 masternode miners. If no one voted, if no one put a proposal up, 60% of the reward would go towards masternodes and 40% towards miners. Any proposal that received greater than 10% net votes would fund, however, up to a cap of 20%. And after removing the proposal funding from the allocation for the month, the remainder would then be split following that period's masternode miner rewards. And so I've put a couple of examples here to better illustrate this. The first is if we assume the current allocation of 10% towards the proposal system were approved in a given month. What that would mean is that 60% of the remainder would go towards masternodes and 40% towards the miners. And so the split would be 10% to the proposal system, 54% to the masternodes, and 36% to the miners. In other words, the masternodes and the miners simply take a 10% haircut off of their default funding split. If the maximum proposal allocation were to occur of 20%, what would that mean? Well, it would mean that the masternodes would receive 60% of the remainder, and miners would receive 40% of the remainder. So we'd see a 20%, 48% to the masternodes, and 32% to the miners. There's a couple things I'd like to point out about this allocation model that I think is important. One is it can cause the miner or masternode allocation to vary from month to month. But when you look at the numbers, it really isn't that large of a number. And in fact, if it can go plus or minus 10% in a given month, around that 10% proposal figure that you see on the left, it could go plus 10%, it could go minus 10% from there, but it's really range bound. And the result is that this is a range that miners and masternodes are used to just on price alone. In a given month, the price of Dash can increase or decrease by 10%. And so if their miner or masternode allocations can increase or decrease by 10%, this is well within the range of a tolerable uncertainty. Second, that is the extent that the range can go from one end to the other. In most months, the variability would be minor. And so I think it gives a great deal of certainty to the miners and masternodes. The cap also ensures that there is a minimum. They know that they will receive, regardless of which proposals are passing. The last thing I would point out is that this, for the first time, creates a healthy dynamic in which masternodes are not incentivized to view the proposal system as free money. A proposal would have to deliver value to the network that exceeds its cost in order for it to be worthwhile for a masternode to approve that proposal. And so I think that if the price of Dash were to spike in the future, they would be far more reluctant than they were in the past to spend the money on dubious proposals or proposals that wouldn't have any type of lasting effect. And so I think it better aligns the incentives on the network and ensures that proposals need to have value. And it also gives the masternodes the flexibility to do more or less if they think that that is the most efficient use of funds. I want to introduce a new issue that I did not bring up back in December. This one is far less mature. I don't have an answer at this point in time, but we do have some ideas that we want to kick off a similar process with the community around to gather input. And that is that voter participation has been dropping. Back in mid-2018, we saw voter participation rates of greater than 50%. And lately we've been trending towards a number just above 30%. And this is voter participation across all proposals. This does not mean that on an average proposal, 30% of people are voting on it. It means that 30% of masternode operators have voted on any proposal that is active for that cycle, including proposals that were carried over from the previous cycle that they happen to have voted on the prior cycle. And the effect of this is that this can have a detrimental effect on the ability of the network to approve quality proposals. Back in May of 2019, we introduced the deterministic masternode list. It caused everyone to have to re-register their masternodes, their voting keys, import their new voting keys into the tools that they use, like Dash Central or whatever, in order to vote. We did see a dramatic drop off during that month, and it was difficult for a proposal to pass that month. And so this is an issue that's been developing for a long period of time. There are reasons for it. One of those reasons is there's an increase in activity from shared masternode services. We've also seen the introduction of planned services for shared masternodes operating on exchanges. If you go to Kraken's website, there is a staking service there, and they've announced that Dash staking is coming soon. Exchanges are slowly beginning to enter this space. We're aware of some other activity related to this. And so a lot of these shared services don't enable the collection of votes from their members. And they don't, therefore, vote the masternodes that they operate. There is at least one that does do that, but the vast majority do not collect that information or enable partial shared voting. They simply don't vote. At the same time, the participants in those shared masternodes nor the masternode service want to necessarily hold back the network from operating. That's not their intent. That certainly isn't the intent of the exchanges that are beginning to enter this market. And we've even seen masternode operators that have come to us and said, hey, I don't really intend on voting. I'm here for the returns. I'm here for the rewards of operating a masternode, but I don't have the time or the inclination or the skill set or what have you to vote. But I don't want to hold the network back. And so this is kind of a developing issue. I don't think it's impacted the ability to pass good proposals yet, but I think that this is something that we should keep an eye on and begin to debate whether or not changes are warranted. If you flip to the next slide, we do have a couple of potential solutions to this issue, and they have various trade-offs. The intent here is to kick off a debate and some feedback on whether or not these should be pursued, and if they should, what type. The first solution is separate out the voter registration process from the masternode registration process in some capacity. Right now, on the left, you see that we have around 4,500 masternodes operating on the network. They all have registered voting keys, of course. Around 2,500 of them never cast a vote, or haven't casted a vote in the last year. Yet, in order for a proposal to pass, around 450 votes are needed out of the 2,000 that participate at all. And so it's really a net 20 to 25% of voters that is needed in order to pass a proposal today. On the right-hand side is an alternative. This is either an opt-in or opt-out voter registration process. This could come in various forms. It could be that you could register a masternode without including a voting key in order to signal that you don't intend to participate and you don't want to count towards the denominator and thus hold the network back from passing proposals. It's just that you don't want to participate in that portion of the benefits of operating a masternode. You could also make this an opt-in process in which you need a separate transaction to the network in addition to your masternode registration in order to register to vote. In this example, perhaps 3,000 masternodes register to vote. They're well-intentioned, they plan on voting, or they want to count in the denominator even though they don't plan to vote. But in any case, you know, a number of masternodes would register to vote or would opt out of the system. And in such a scenario where 3,000 masternodes were registered, you'd need 10% of that lower number. And so this would empower masternodes with the ability to signal whether or not they want to be considered in the voting system. As I mentioned, this could be opt-in, it could be opt-out. In any case, if we were to make this type of change, I would propose that it would be only on a go-forward basis that would not require anyone to re-register their masternode. We would simply presume that anyone that already had a registered masternode would not want to opt out. So I don't, you know, we certainly wouldn't want to disenfranchise anyone. On intent was this would only come through explicit signaling from new masternodes or people that chose to re-register their masternodes without voting keys, as an example. And so this would lower that threshold. It would allow for, over time, the services that are spinning up on the network, like shared masternode services from exchanges, from kind of registering in a way that would hamper the network's ability to operate. Another potential solution here is what we're calling the variable denominator. This was an idea that was put forward by Quantum Explorer. Again, on the left, you see the existing system today for comparison. The way that this one would work is that the network would simply look at the last voting cycle and evaluate how many masternodes actually voted in that cycle. If around 2,000 of them voted, it would set a threshold based on that. So net votes to pass might increase in order to compensate for the fact that some of them would automatically not be counted in the denominator. Perhaps we would shift it to 20% of those that voted in the prior cycle. And so in this example, if 2,000 masternodes voted in the last cycle and that threshold were at 20% net votes, you would need 400 net votes in order for a proposal to pass. The advantage of this is that it automatically adjusts over time if someone registers to vote but never does, just because they forget or have good intentions but never quite get around to it, along with their gym membership. I think that it allows for this adjustment to happen automatically. It does still allow someone to signal that they want to count in the denominator simply by casting an abstain vote for the cycle on any proposal. That would count as having voted. And if your intent is to say, hey, I want to count in that denominator, but I don't really want to approve any of these proposals, it allows you to do that. And so I think that both of these options would empower masternodes with new options to signal some of the things that they've been asking for. The exchanges, the shared masternode operators, and the people that provide collateral to those shared masternodes have all expressed an interest in being able to do something like this. And as we look at the data, it does seem like there could be a developing issue here that would warrant such change. Now, we did introduce the ability to delegate votes back when we introduced the deterministic masternode list back in May of last year. It does seem that very few people have taken advantage of that and allocated their vote to someone that cast their votes on their behalf. We simply haven't seen widespread use of that feature. It was our hope that that would allow participation to increase, but that simply hasn't been the case. And so we are watching this. This is something that we feel like should be debated at least as to whether or not these types of changes are beneficial. And if so, what type of solution might we pursue? These are just a couple of the ideas that have been thrown out. There are other ideas. I think that our community might be a source of good ideas on how to address the issue. There are other ideas like paying people to vote. Those have advantages and disadvantages as well. It can encourage people simply to cast a vote so they can get paid without actually evaluating them. So, that there is no perfect solution. We just want to have the debate, get input from the community, and see whether or not pursuing some type of change in our proposal system would be warranted. Next slide. All right, the last major issue that we brought up back in December that we wanted to address as part of this was the fees that are charged on the network. We argued that more rational fees are needed. Fees were last set back in January of 2018. That was near the peak price of Dash. And currently the minimum fee for a one input, one output transaction is around 1/100th of a penny. And that no longer covers the cost of a transaction. That is allowing frequent spamming on the network, and that affects our users. It also affects the economics of operating masternodes or other infrastructure on the network, and raises the costs of being able to safely provide services. When you talk to users, they frequently reference that fees are under a cent, but they don't reference just how far under a cent they are. Few people really understand how cheap a Dash transaction is, and they don't really differentiate between extremely low and very, very, very low. And so we're postulating that any fees less than 1 cent are unlikely to impact the type of usage that Dash is targeting. And so we're simply proposing that we, on a periodic basis, as we have in the past, continue to update the default fee, the setting that is included in the software that dictates what the minimum fee is to relay a message around the network or to mine it into a block. And that default setting is really important because most people do not change that default setting. What we'd like to do is periodically retarget a default minimum fee of around 1/10 of a penny or 1/10 of a cent, and that's around 7 times the current rate. That would do a great deal to dissuade spam attacks, make them smaller, but also make those quote attacks profitable for the network. If we can economically service those requests, they aren't truly an attack any longer. At the same time, retargeting 1/10 of a cent would allow for significant price appreciation to occur while maintaining this kind of mantra that fees are under 1 cent. We could approach a price of $700 and safely maintain fees under that rate. And so this is something that we will simply aim to do going forward in order to maintain rational fees on the network that makes sense and protect the users from having effectively an outage from congestion on the network. When it comes to lowering fees, it's very easy to do. It doesn't have an effect on wallets. It doesn't have an effect on users. You might be able to pay less and not know it, but it tends to work fine. Raising fees is much more difficult. We're only going to be raising fees when we're making a breaking change to the protocol anyway, essentially following a hard fork. And if we're following a hard fork anyway, that's a good opportunity if we need to raise them. We do have some protocol breaking changes that are coming up in an upcoming release. And at that point in time, we plan to introduce a different default setting that will hopefully address this issue for the community. So those are the 3 areas that we wanted to propose changes to the network. The first is on the allocation of the rewards. The second is on the introduction of a more flexible proposal system. And the third being the fee changes. We think a vote is warranted on the first 2. The third one, given that this is simply a setting that anyone is welcome to change within the wallets, and given it's essentially a performance and safety issue for the network, we think that that's something that we should just do on a periodic basis. If there are objections to that, I'm certainly open to hearing those objections, but I think that this is just a continuation of something that we've done in the past, just to keep the fees manageable on the network. There are some potential objections to these 3 things, and I'd like to proactively address some of those. The first that I've heard is, well, would Dash remain secure? And the answer is yes, it would. Dash would remain the dominant X11 chain, even with a reward reallocation. If you look at Dash's hash rate versus other coins that use X11, we account for almost all of the hash rate. That hash rate is at a record of around 6 petahashes right now. And so even after reallocation would be heavily dominant within the X11 space. The second thing is that chain locks have already reduced our orphan rates. If you look at the 10 months prior to chain locks being implemented and the 10 months since, we find that orphan rates have dropped about 97%. That metric implies that Dash may be about 30% more secure with chain locks than without it. And so moderate reallocation away from miners and towards masternodes after witnessing that security enhancement that chain locks delivers, I think that that is more than reasonable in terms of maintaining Dash's security. Also, as a reminder, chain lock security actually increases with masternode count, and a reallocation would actually support a masternode count increase. It would make it harder to overtake the network through chain lock disruption. And it's also true that an increased budget that may result from this reallocation would support software development. And as we've seen, more hash rate is not the only way to secure a network. Chain locks was performed by developers and implemented by developers, and it made our network far more secure than some incremental hash rate would have. And so when you ask the question, would we remain secure or not, the answer to that question is undoubtedly yes. This is a very moderate change, and we have all these other mechanisms in place to keep the network secure. The next concern that I've heard is, well, miners aren't financially incentivized to follow this. This is bad for miners. It's bad for miners that have made an investment in our network. And it's impossible to know exactly all of the factors that will affect our price going forward. But if you assume that the market cap of our circulating supply is effectively fixed as these changes take place, what you find is that at least for the next couple of years, the increased demand for Dash that would accompany a growth in our masternode count would more than offset the declines in rewards that miners would have, the reduction in rewards that miners would experience during this couple of year period. I plotted this on a smaller scale so you could see the changes, but I think it illustrates the point a little bit more by zooming out to 100% cumulative miner revenue impact on an index of 100. In the near term, this would have almost no effect. Now, beyond Q4 2022, it seems very likely that miners would receive less reward in fiat terms, even after that effect is taken into account. But the important thing to note here is with existing equipment, they would have plenty of time in order to monetize that. And so in fiat terms, they would have the ability to monetize their investments. It also allows ample time for existing mining equipment to run its full course and for new decisions on investments to be made based on full knowledge of what the rewards will be in the future. It also doesn't take into effect secondary effects. So if we have a more stable market cap ranking and more stable price, that should lead naturally to faster growth and adoption of users. That additional benefit would likely offset this even more and mean that even for miners, this would be a positive change over the next couple of years, the time period during which they're monetizing their existing equipment. And all of this does not take into account that when we made the announcement that we did back in December, that alone has a dampening effect on the investment in new mining equipment, because it introduced the risk that there would be a reward reallocation in the future or a shift to proof of stake, which was something that was being discussed at that time. And as a consequence, likely miners have faced less competition than they otherwise would on the mining equipment that they'd purchased over the last 5 months or so. And so net, I think that even when I look at this from a miner perspective, this is a net positive change, and would allow them to get more value out of the investments that they've made. I know how counterintuitive that is. And I'm certainly not saying that beyond the year 2021, 2022, that they wouldn't see a reduction in revenue. They would. But by then, we're talking about the next generation of mining equipment, and they would have all foresight into how much of that equipment would be a rational purchase to make. And so I do think that there's, in conversations I've had with some of our miners, I know that there is openness to this idea that it may actually be beneficial to them. There are other potential objections. I'm not going to do a slide on every single one of those, but I'll briefly cover some of these here. On the upper grouping there, those are related to the reallocation. The lower right is related to the proposal system, and the lower left is the fees. Starting with the top grouping, one of the things I hear is there are lots of elements that move price and feed volatility. That is absolutely true, and I fully agree with that. User adoption matters. Marketing and communication matter. Press coverage matters. Regulatory changes matter. The decisions of exchanges on whether or not to support a coin matter. Delivery of new technology and innovations matter. There are many, many things that affect price, and I'm not trying to say that this is the sole contributor. We have to continue to do all of those other things, and address legal challenges and all of the things that matter for our long-term success. And so why address this? Well, this is something that we've identified as an issue. We've been able to prove through statistical analysis that this is something that has a significant impact on our market performance, and it's addressable. And so I'm not saying that we don't need to do all those other things. We do need to continue to focus on adoption, usability, new tech, all of those other things, and we're working on those things too. So I don't want this to take away from any of that other stuff. I think they're all important. This is something we identified that is addressable. And so that's the reason we're having this conversation. Another one is that after the reallocation period ends, we're going to face the same issue. Well, that is true. When the reallocation is over at the end of 2026, we would have a similar issue, and the ROI would begin to drop at that point in time. However, there's two things that are important here. One is, at that point in time, the issue is much smaller in nature. The natural rate of growth of the coin supply and the base of coins in circulation would both be very different than they are today. And so on a percentage basis, or percentage annualized growth basis, the issue would be much, much smaller. And secondly, I think that over such a long period of time, we have the ability to create new revenue streams. We've talked about things like rewards programs for merchants. We've talked about things like, the fees on platform from applications and things of that nature being a new revenue source. And so when you look at this over such a long period of time, we think that there's adequate opportunity to create some of those other revenue streams that would provide additional stabilization. So this addresses this kind of short-term issue that we showed in the one slide, and that strategy of just flattening the curve. The next criticism or concern is that reduction in mining rewards will lead to a lower price. I have heard this theory put forward. The data simply didn't support that. I would also point to other networks like Bitcoin. When they go through a halvening and the supply to miners drops, it does not cause a decrease in the price. In fact, the evidence is the opposite, that when you reduce supply, price tends to increase. And that's in line with economic principles that supply and demand dictate price. When you reduce supply and keep demand the same, price tends to increase. And so there simply isn't any support whatsoever that the amount being spent on mining somehow translates into the value of the coin. The next is we could reduce miner allocations even more and remain the dominant chain. That is also true. We could do a larger reallocation. So why not do it? I think there's a couple potential answers to that. One is that flattening the curve becomes increasingly expensive. As you try to smush that curve down even further out into the future, it takes more and more of a reallocation in order to accomplish that. That's kind of issue number one. And so kind of the cost benefit starts to change as you do a larger and larger reallocation. The second is that you start to impact the X11 dominance, or the degree to which we're dominant within the space. We don't know what will happen over such a long period of time, but I think that chain locks are not perfect. They have on occasion failed in the past for brief periods of time. And during those periods of time, we do fall back on proof of work. And so we want proof of work to remain a reliable source of security. It's also true that a larger coin, just take Bitcoin Cash as an example, they are not their dominant chain. And they could seek out an algorithm that they could switch to in which they would be the dominant chain. If they were to do something like that and choose X11, we would then be dependent on our chain locks, and we would want to try to maintain as much of the X11 hash rate as we can. And so I think that we have protections in place against this, but given the limited benefit of doing a lot more of a reallocation, it may not be beneficial overall when you consider the security implications. In the lower right, some of the concerns I've heard, if we change the proposal system in such a way that masternodes have their rewards reduced by approving proposals, they won't approve anything. Well, I think that's unlikely. I think masternode operators, first and foremost, are Dash holders, and they're significant ones. They want to do what is best for the coin, and it's hard to see a scenario where defunding all of the teams that are working for the network would be beneficial for the long-term value of Dash. I've spoken to many masternode owners about this, and I've rarely heard of anyone expressing this type of sentiment that they might fund less as a result. I think that the effect is more likely to be on more dubious proposals where the value isn't clear to them. I've also heard the criticism, we don't need a cap on the proposal system funding at all if we do something like that. That may be true. It may be true that masternodes would never exceed 20% or 30% or some number and maintain a certain amount of rewards for miners and masternodes in order to continue incentivizing that portion of the ecosystem. I think the 20% cap is healthy for a couple of reasons. One is it provides some minimum assurances to miners and masternode operators that are investing in our ecosystem as to what type of allocation they can expect to receive. And that surety can provide confidence to be able to make those investments. And ultimately, we need miners and we need masternode operators in order for the network to function and remain secure. And so I think that having a cap there is nonetheless healthy, even if it's just providing a bit more flexibility. I've also heard, well, if we increase the proposal cap to 20%, the masternodes will surely waste all of those funds. So I've heard, people aren't going to approve anything and then people are going to approve everything. Well, the evidence doesn't support that. In our current system, which has no trade-off, there's no downside to approving a new proposal. The masternodes do not fully utilize the 10%, even when there are proposals that they could spend the money on. And so in the current system, they're already not exhibiting this behavior. And so I think it's even less likely that if this is affecting their own rewards, that they're likely to behave in such a way under the proposed system. And so I think some of these concerns they're valid to talk about. I don't think that when you look at the evidence that there's any support that type of behavior would result. And then lastly, in the lower left here, we have higher fees will result in less usage. That is absolutely true. When you raise the cost of something, consumption of it is likely to drop. But I think it's important to look at, well, what type of usage would be affected? Well, certainly the spam would be affected because you'd be able to afford less spam for the same amount of money. I think the second issue is that, or the second point here is that when you're talking about fractions of a penny, it's unlikely to affect anything from a coffee purchase on up, right? I think that everyday users are going to continue to behave in exactly the same way that they do today. The transactions that might be affected are micropayments, machine-to-machine type payments that might be utilized on the network today. Those don't really drive a lot of value for the network. Microtransactions don't really consume much Dash in order to facilitate them. And these are also transactions that we lose money on every single transaction that takes place. The cost of data storage alone exceeds the fee that is collected and distributed by the network. And so, I think that we have to be willing to acknowledge that our technology is not ideally suited for every type of transaction. We're optimized for speed. And we're optimized for speed on transactions larger than a couple of cents. And that's the strategy that we're following. All of our growth markets are in those areas. Microtransactions is not an area that we're targeting, and it's not an area that our technology is particularly well suited for. And so I think we just need to acknowledge that and be willing to let a portion of the market go that we're simply not aiming to address. And that's exactly what a fee increase would do. And so, yes, it is true that it will result in less usage, but it won't affect the usage in the markets that we're targeting. And so that's the important distinction there. Next slide. So this is the last section. This is, well, what will the process be moving forward from here? If you flip to the next one. We will be issuing detailed pre-proposals next week for the community to discuss, and we'll gauge the level of support from those discussions. If the level of support is quite high, we may move forward with formal decision proposals on the network, on the block reward reallocation and the flexible proposal system, potentially in this cycle. If there doesn't seem to be a great deal of broad-based support after having the answer to the opportunity to answer Q&A and debate this amongst the community, and further refinement is required, we may go back to the drawing board on some of these things. So I think it really depends on how well received these proposals are. I recognize that it is going to be impossible to align everyone on all of these changes. We're all going to have different opinions and views. The goal here is to get the majority of the community to support some of these changes. And so we'll gauge that, and based on that, we'll make a decision about moving forward. I am going to be holding AMAs, additional Q&A sessions. We're going to be publishing this video out to the community so that they can watch it at their leisure. And so we'll be doing a number of things to kind of gauge the level of support for these things so that we can make a decision about whether to move forward with a formal proposal. And then when it comes to major releases in the future, this is when we'll have the opportunity to incorporate some of these changes. Something as small as the fee adjustments or reallocations may be easier to implement than the flexible proposal system. We will get these features out if they are approved as soon as is feasible within our roadmap. And so it is feasible for some of these changes to come out as early as the fall if they are approved in the June cycle. So that's kind of the timeline, the rough timeline that we're looking at, and it really depends on whether or not this is a convincing proposal for the majority of masternode operators and the community as a whole. And with that, I think that we've covered everything. And we can open it up for questions. And I know that a number of questions have been submitted kind of as I've been speaking, quite a few actually. And so I'm not sure how we want to moderate this. Michael, if you want to kind of pull out the best questions, or if you want to kind of run through them one by one.
Yep, I've got some questions ready for you, Ryan. So I'll read them to you, and then you can take it away. Sound good?
Okay. Yeah.
All right. The first question is from Kirk T333. It says circulating supply increased by more absolutely and percentage-wise when the price went from 12 to 1,500. So why is that a problem now?
Well, the circulating supply increased starting in mid-2017 at a pretty good clip. The market as a whole was going up. The second half of 2017, it was almost impossible for price to drop, regardless of which asset you were talking about. And that is the period in which Dash's relative market performance started to lag. And so, as I said before, there are many things that affect price, and probably the primary one is the market as a whole. I think, if the crypto markets are doubling in a quarter, it's pretty tough not to come close to that for your own token. And so when I analyzed these things, I analyzed them on a relative to the rest of the market basis for that reason. It isolates a lot of that broad-based market moves. and so, yeah, I mean, prior to 2017, there was some expansion in it. Remember, a second component of this is that a big chunk of that expansion was simply Evan Duffield turning his masternodes off under pressure from the community. So that wasn't a true expansion of the circulating supply when you think about the purpose of that measure. It's not that a bunch of masternodes spun down and sent their masternode collateral out into the market. It's simply that they turned off, and none of that actually was circulating back into the market. So, you know, that's a highly unusual circumstance. It's one that I think you need to consider when you're making the assertion that, you know, in 2017 there was this huge expansion in supply in the first half of the year. That simply isn't the case. And we can actually see on the blockchain, and I included this back in the December presentation, the consolidation that Evan did of all of his masternodes into a single address, and or a set of addresses, a single wallet, I should say. And I presented that evidence at the time. So I think that, you know, there was this kind of broad move that occurred in these measures, but that didn't necessarily translate into reality. And I think that when you look at 2018, 2019, we all felt the price pressure, and we all felt kind of as a community the relative market performance. And I think it was difficult at the time to explain why, because it seemed like we were getting traction with adoption and new exchanges and support for our features and technological advances with chain locks and instant send. It felt like everything was hitting on all cylinders except price. And, you know, I think that the attempt here is to explain some of that and do it in a way that's statistically supportable.
Okay. The second question is from Dan E.L. And he asks, could the market be discounting the price due to anticipation for delivery of Dash platform?
Absolutely. I think that, as I've said many times, I don't think that this is the only thing affecting Dash's price. I do think that it affects Dash's price, and we've shown it here, that it affects it over long periods of time in kind of an accumulated fashion. You can't be growing your circulating supply at 23% and expect the market to maintain price parity against assets that are increasing their supply much less. And so I think that that is the issue that we're trying to address here. Now, in terms of delivery on Evolution, you know, we saw a positive reaction from the market when we put that onto our first public test net back in December. We did there were a number of functionalities that were missing from that release. We rolled out a new version back in February or March, I think it was, another one in April, another one that we're going to release before the end of this quarter that will add the credit system to, and we'll be able to take off all the constraints surrounding the credit system that are currently in place there. And so we're now on the path of resolving some of the security issues with it. It's fully functional, and we simply need to get the security issues resolved before we go to mainnet. But we did see a positive impact on the price back then. There was also word that had to do with the fact that Burger King had made an announcement in Venezuela that we were being adopted. I don't know to what extent those two things that happened at almost exactly the same day had on the price, but these other things do affect price too. And as I said in the presentation, we have to keep focusing on those things. We have to keep delivering new versions. We have to keep delivering new functionality, and we have to deliver on adoption. We have to continue with our business development efforts in order to see Dash used. And so all of those things will continue. I'm not discounting any of the importance of those things.
Great. Question 3 is more of a comment from Guzman Pintos. He states, you're comparing emission rates of assets that have more history and hence more having. Current BTC or LTC emission rates can't be compared to Dash.
That is one of the reasons why those other coins have a lower percentage growth than Dash. That is absolutely true. There's other reasons too. If you model out our quote halvening, it takes about 10 years. At a 7% annualized drop, it takes Dash about 10 years to go through a halvening. And so our halvenings just don't take place as quickly as those other assets. So besides being older, there are other differences between our networks. The causes of those differences, in my mind, are kind of irrelevant. The bottom line is that those differences exist, that the emission rate is different. All else being equal, if you had a choice between two assets, one of which was inflating its supply at a rapid rate, doubling every year, and one that was growing very slowly, which would you choose? I think the answer is quite obvious. However, all things are not equal between these coins. I think we have better tech, we have better adoption, we've got a better proposal system. We have a proposal system that funds our growth. We've had more consistent growth in users, active addresses, wallet downloads, every metric you could imagine. We're seeing better growth. And so I don't think we have to match those other assets. I just think we need to have a competitive growth rate. 23% annualized growth in our supply is not that competitive. And we need to treat the currency itself as a product. We need to improve that product.
Question 4 is from August Domenchuk. How do you plan to continue increasing development activity and innovation on the network? I like what we've set up with the Dash Dev group and the bounty system.
So this is kind of an unrelated question to what we're talking about. In terms of innovation, I'm happy to talk about that. I just don't think that this call is the purpose. What I can do is I could probably address that question through a written response. If we want to collect things that aren't really related to this, I'd be happy to respond to those in written form, similar to what we do with quarterly call questions that we can't get to. I'd like to devote this time to these proposals, unless I'm misinterpreting the question, but I don't see a correlation there between these two.
Perfect. Question 5 is from Kirk T333. How about if the foundation or DCG buy up coins and start running masternodes or enabling staking? Masternode voting is already low, and who better to vote on proposals than people who work on it daily?
I think there would be a great deal of concern with Dash Core Group operating masternodes and voting on it. I think there's a lot of advantages with us not operating masternodes. One is that we can interface with regulators and say, hey, we don't have any insight into the activity on the network because we don't operate it. We simply produce the software that other people use to operate it. Beyond that, I think there would be some concern that Dash Core Group would be casting votes on its own proposals. As a masternode owner myself, I would probably have a problem with that. Secondly, I don't know where the money would come from. We draw from the network what we need to operate. And so we don't have a large amount of Dash that we're sitting on that we could use to spin up masternodes. And ultimately that funding would need to come from somewhere. So I don't really see many advantages in doing that.
Okay. Question number 6 is from Eric Sammons. This is about the slide with the growth in masternode count by ROI. He says, that seems like a small sample size with 1 point, the one at the top of the graph, impacting it dramatically. On the left side, there are only 2 data points above the ones on the right. So he's talking about the data points.
Yeah. The sample size is somewhere around 30, which is approaching what's considered a large sample size. I don't remember the exact number, but it's really close to 30. So it's borderline a large sample size. It is true that we've had very few instances of change in circulating supply being negative within a quarter. However, I think that the data size is large enough that this should be statistically significant. Would I like more? Sure. I don't have foresight into the future, and that's where the future data points need to come from. I can say that on the instances in which we've seen some of the highest performance, probably 3 of the 4 best quarters we've ever had on a relative basis to the rest of the market have come when the circulating supply has shrunk. And so I think that the evidence is, it's not perfect, but we did achieve an R-squared value of 0.22, and that's pretty significant. Considering that there are so many things that affect price, that's a significant R-squared value for a result like this. Would I like more data points on the left to be able to say with certainty? Sure. But we don't have that luxury. We have to make decisions off of imperfect information. And the question is this good enough of evidence that these correlations exist? I think that, in my opinion, I think it is, particularly when you go back to economic principles and say, well, is it logical that if I increase the masternode ROI that it would encourage the creation of more masternodes? Well, yes, it is. That's pretty logical. And if masternodes are being created as a response to that, and they're, investors are buying 1,000 Dash in order to do it, would that have a positive impact on price? Well, the answer to that question is also yes. And so it's not just that we see a correlation here, it's that there is a story backing it up that makes sense. And so I think when you take all of these things together, you need to recognize, yes, the data is not perfect. There's a lot of noise in the data because there's a lot of other potential explanations for price that muddies the data. But the data clearly supports it, and the logic clearly backs up the data.
Question 7 is from August Dominchuk. He asks, has the network talked about specialized roles or abilities for certain masternodes? In example, roles and badges for long-term contributing masternodes owners with contextual voting weights based on experience and expertise.
That's not something that we've talked about. If there are specific ideas, I would suggest, typing them up. You can share that with the community. You could share that with Dash Core Group, and I'd be happy to look at what exactly that would entail and what the benefits might be. I think, there's advantages and disadvantages to something like that. If I understand it correctly, advantage is it encourages long-term participation. Disadvantage is it might disenfranchise the new masternode owners that we'd like to attract. If they come into the ecosystem and don't have an equal say, that might be discouraging. And so I think if we follow something like that, we need to carefully consider some of those trade-offs and debate them. That isn't typical. You look at things like corporations and shareholders. A shareholder is a shareholder. They all get a vote typically on, at least if they're voting shares. And they don't differentiate based on how long you've held those shares. And I think they do that for a reason. But I'd be happy to kind of look at alternative improvements or things.
Question number 8 is from Kirk T333. Why not just make this block allocation change all in one shot rather than over 5 years? 5 years in crypto is far too long as the world is changing rapidly and may make Dash irrelevant by then.
Yeah, so the reason why I would argue against making the change immediate is that it would have a one-time effect. It might last a few quarters as the market may take some time to react to that fully, but it would cause a rapid investment in masternodes, likely, followed by yet another period of underperformance as the hangover kind of took effect. So let's step through what exactly would happen if we did that. If we did a sudden reallocation, there'd be a few effects. One is we truly would be disenfranchising our miners at that point because it wouldn't necessarily they wouldn't have time to collect Dash over the next couple of years at a higher rate. Second, it would cause investment in masternodes at a rapid rate that would undoubtedly spike the price. And following the accumulation of those masternodes, you would actually have a lower base of circulating supply at that point in time because it would have pulled a lot of the collateral out of the market. So with a smaller base, and now the same issue that we faced in the past would come true, that, back in 2018, 2019, we faced this, 20% plus growth in our inflation rate. We would just bring that back. It just would happen, a year from now or something. And so I think what we're aiming to do here is truly address this issue once and for all. And that's why we're proposing doing it slowly over time. That provides this nice, smooth runway to get us to a point in the future where this just doesn't matter anymore. And it also would have a stabilizing effect for our users. I think ultimately, if we want to gain adoption and have long-term growth, we can't have these wild swings going either way.
Question number 9, the Joker 585 has asked, why not accelerate the block reward reduction instead of increasing masternode reward?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
Why not accelerate the block reward reduction instead of increasing masternode rewards?
Accelerate the masternode node.
No,
I see. Why not just decrease the number of coins being created?
I think so. I think that's what they're asking. Yeah.
Okay. Look, it is possible to change the coin supply. It's certainly more possible to reduce it than to increase it because no one is harmed necessarily by a reduction that's holding the coin today. In fact, that's primarily a benefit if I'm going to be diluted less as a user. I think those types of changes are far more controversial. That's almost a religious change to some people in the community, and I think it would be much more difficult to get a change like that across. When we have tools like this available to us to manage it in a different way, where we're not proposing changes to the actual supply of the coin, I think that is a preferable route because it's likely to garner better support. And so that would be my answer to that. I don't think it's impossible. I think that if there was widespread enough support, you could change the coin supply or the emission schedule in some way, as long as you weren't ultimately creating more coins in the long run. So, I think it's something that we thought about. I think it's something that wasn't too seriously considered simply because of the challenges with making a change of that that's that drastic.
Question number 11 is from Thomas Z. Why not lower the masternode? Sorry, question number 10. Why not lower the masternode collateral or fractional masternodes? It would encourage people who happen to not just have 80+ thousand to invest, or introduce fractional masternodes.
So a couple answers to that. One is that's a significant undertaking. It would take a long time to introduce something like that. It would cost a lot of money in development effort and would take us away from some of our other activities that we're working on. And so that's reason number one. Reason number two is, as we got into the analysis, we realized that the changes needed to address this specific issue were relatively minor. Therefore, that seemed like the most direct path to addressing the concern. Another reason is that we don't actually know what the resulting behavior change would be as a result of introducing shared master nodes. If you introduce shared master nodes, you may see the creation of many more shared master nodes, and that would cause the ROI experienced by masternode ownership to drop. And that could in turn simply result in many of the existing masternodes deciding, you know what, at this lower rate, I'm going to sell. And the net effect could be next to nothing. And so, we may go through that effort and not get the results that we're hoping for. We're also seeing that exchanges are beginning to operate shared masternodes effectively anyway. Now, there is an argument to say, well, isn't it more secure for shared masternodes to be supported at the protocol level? I think the answer is undoubtedly yes, but are credible exchanges like Kraken inherently dangerous? Probably not. These firms invest heavily in security, probably more so than an individual does. And so I think the probability of loss is likely larger with self-management than it is with an exchange. And so we do see expansion in the shared masternode market taking place, and it's happening with more established, insured entities that are insured against these types of losses. So we don't think that there will be a lack of options for people willing to stake their Dash. That decreases the incremental value of creating a decentralized solution for that. The last thing I would point to is that shared masternodes kind of have a number of complications with them from a security standpoint, because ultimately someone needs to operate the masternode. When you have a person who can effectively spin up as many masternodes as they can attract collateral for, they can end up controlling a large portion of your network without having a significant portion of Dash themselves. That can create a security concern if these are being used for things like chain locks and instant send locks and things of that nature. And so do we want to introduce security concerns to the network? Probably not. Now, that's also true of exchanges, but exchanges, I think, are sufficiently decentralized in terms of their deposits, where no one exchange is likely to control 60% of the network that's necessary to disrupt things like chain locks. So, I think net, there simply isn't huge benefit to the users of being able to form a shared masternode. And there's huge complications security-wise and from the ability to execute that versus this proposal. In terms of lowering the threshold for masternode ownership to say 500 instead of 1,000, the net result would be we'd end up with roughly double the number of masternodes, give or take. We don't know exactly how that would play out because there are fixed costs associated with operating a masternode. At the same time, it might open up the possibility for people who have $40,000 instead of $80,000 to operate one. The reason we haven't pursued this in the past is we really have the target amount of infrastructure that we need. 3 to 5,000 was always kind of the target for masternode on the network. As you increase the number, it does slow the network down. It does make consensus more difficult. And so if we were to double the number of masternodes on the network, that would have the effect of having some negative impacts on network performance and scalability. That isn't desirable. And given that we'd have roughly the same collateral going into masternodes as we have today, I don't think that there would be much benefit there. The bottom line is that the proposal that we're putting forward has the most predictable outcome possible out of all the options we looked at. There were simply too many variables with some of those other options, oftentimes in conflict with each other, that made it really hard to predict what the impact might be. And as we said all along, we're trying to minimize the risk to the network here, and we're trying to create stability. And when we make dramatic changes like those, it runs the risk of instability. So in summary, I mean, given that these shared services are available today and are migrating to more credible and insured platforms like exchanges for staking, and that access is coming anyway, and given the fact that it would be more complicated to implement, and given the fact that we wouldn't reliably be able to predict the impact on the network and the stability it would bring, that combination was not something that was attractive relative to what we've presented.
Question 12 is from Kirk T333. What would the advantage be of Dash over things like Libra when this comes online? It's a drastic move to solidify Dash as digital cash be needed now. A plan that stretches 5+ years is too mild.
It sounds like there's a few different things there, and I didn't hear a question. Or I think the question was towards the beginning, and then there was some kind of backstory behind it. But I think that Libra is, a platform that is likely to be highly aligned with the Facebook ecosystem. It's yet to determine whether or not that's likely to launch. There are advantages and disadvantages that Libra would offer to users versus Dash. I think, the bottom line is, in some ways we do compete, in other ways we wouldn't. I think that people that are seeking out a true cryptocurrency, one that is not tied to the dollar or the yen or anything else, and that wants control over their money and the freedom to use it the way that they want to, is the crowd that we're going to be attracted, that's going to be attracted to Dash, along with people that are speculative investors that believe in our mission, that think that our adoption is going to translate into growth in the future. And so, I think that there are different philosophies on what a cryptocurrency can and should be, and we're going to attract different types of users. I, for one, would never want to use Libra, especially if it's just a digital dollar. A lot of people aren't interested in adopting a currency that's at the moment growing at more than 30% annualized. That's likely to lead to inflation or other asset inflation issues. And we're already seeing some of the effects of that. So yes, I do think that we're going to have competition, and that's okay. I think we need to become the best cryptocurrency we can be and compete on that basis.
The next question is from Darren Tapp. What does the slide about projected ROI for masternodes assume about the dash price?
Sorry, which one?
What does the slide about projected ROI for masternodes assume about the dash price?
So it doesn't actually have to predict anything about the dash price because it's an ROI based on dash denominated returns. So if the price of dash goes up, the cost of the collateral goes up at the same proportion that the value of the rewards go up in fiat terms. And so regardless of whether the price is 100 or 1,000, the ROI in terms of dash is the same. So it doesn't assume anything. It just projects forward what is the block reward, what are transaction fees, assuming we keep growing at 5% per year or 5% per quarter or something over a given period of time, and what would the masternodes earn during that period, and then it basically assumes that blended ROI continues into the future, that between the real ROI and nominal ROI. And so those two numbers converge as the block reward goes down. That's the driver for those two numbers converging on each other. All other assumptions just remain the same.
Okay, and we're going to do one final question. This one is from Dashanalyst, I think that's how you say it. How is the price for mixing transactions for private send affected if you change the transaction fees?
That's a good question. I think that we'd have to take a closer look at that. Technically, masternode mixing is, were they talking about private send transactions or the mixing transactions?
I believe mixing specifically is what they
Okay. So the way that mixing transaction fees are collected, they're collected periodically. They're not associated with the mix itself. The mix appears on the blockchain as a fee-free transaction. They have a number of inputs and the same number of outputs in the same denominations in total. And so no fee is collected in the mix itself, and that would remain. The fee is collected separately, and it's not collected every mix. It's like every 10th mix, I don't remember. And so, a wallet will periodically be required to make a transaction fee. I don't know if we would change those as a result of this or not. We'd have to evaluate what the total cost of the mixing each one of those fees is meant to address and probably change it accordingly. So it's a good question, but kind of one of those implementation details that we'll have to look at. So here's what I would propose. I know we're out of time. We are going to be holding additional Q&A sessions, both in text form as well as a video call that hopefully we'll be able to have enable voice on. I'm not sure, depends what tools we have available to us, and have more conversations on these things. We'll publish a schedule of what we plan to do over the next week or so, and there'll be plenty more opportunities to answer Q&As. We'll save some of the questions that we got here and try to address them in the next video that we produce, and carry those forward. Anything that we can't get to after we do a couple of these, we'll convert to written form, similar to what we do with the quarterly, to make sure that all the questions are answered. I hope this was helpful in really understanding what it is that, or what the dynamics of the network are and what our findings have been, understanding how we landed at the proposal that we're putting forward, and explains well what exactly it is. I think this is the first step of many that's going to be necessary to make such a significant change to the network. But it's also not unprecedented that we make these types of changes. So, you know, I'm excited about the opportunity to kind of make a significant improvement through these changes in the economics and the way that our network incentivizes behaviors. I think it can have a significant impact and help us to grow even faster. So I look forward to addressing more questions in the future. This is just the start, and we'll keep having these until everybody's questions are answered. And I just want to recognize we're not all going to agree on this, right? I think there are, much of this is opinion based. The data is not 100% perfect. We don't have the ability to see the future. But I hope that I'm presenting a compelling argument for the type of modest change that we're talking about here. And I hope that we can align the community on the need for the change. So thank you very much for joining. We'll get a schedule out to the community shortly to have further engagement on this. I'll try to spend a bit of time on Discord and some of these other venues to try and just pop in and see if I have a few minutes and just kind of talk about some of the things, and we'll go from there. I'm looking forward to it, and I'm excited to get this out there. We've been working on it for a long time.